When I left off my survey of the post-war recovery in the Cold War, I had a pretty exciting story to tell about boom times in Western Europe and the United States. Well, the boom didn't last. The last quarter of the 20th century saw a major slowdown in economic growth, especially in the 1970s. This chart is a little confusing since the countries aren't in the same order in each column, but you should be able to identify the downward trend in the annual growth rate of GDP, or gross domestic product, or total economic output. Note that the United States was experiencing the same slowing growth, although it improved after the 1970s. Many countries, including the United States, were hit by both inflation, that means rising price levels, and unemployment, which meant more people out of work. The late 1960s and early 1970s also saw an outbreak of discontent with the modern capitalist democracies, especially on the part of young people. In America, the Vietnam War sparked major protests on university campuses and a growing disillusionment with the expensive and not obviously especially successful policy of containment. There were student riots in Europe as well, most famously in Paris in 1968. This short video captures the event and suggests some reasons for the outbreak, which you should write down in your notes. As the West lost confidence, the Soviet Union seemed to be gaining confidence. The Soviet Union supported the Vietnamese in their long and ultimately successful war with the United States and took an increasingly active role in Africa, often using Cuban forces as kind of a proxy army. The pink on this map shows allies of the Soviet Union and countries which received major Soviet military aid. And here is a chart that made people in the West very nervous. This is a comparison between the number of nuclear warheads that each country possessed. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union overtook the United States. What's more, Soviet warheads were bigger and more powerful, although they were not necessarily more accurate. So let's return to the People's Century video series and to Moscow in 1972. The Soviet army had repeated its suppression of an Eastern European rebellion by invading Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, in 1968. Unfortunately, we're not showing that. Now, for the first time, the Soviet Union invaded a country that was not part of the already established and accepted Soviet bloc. They invaded neighboring Afghanistan. Afghanistan had been ruled by a communist puppet leader with close ties to Moscow, but little support at home. Russia became increasingly dissatisfied with his leader's ability to maintain law and order against rising Islamic forces. Sound familiar? And so they invaded. Let's watch how the ABC Nightly News reported the invasion. But Afghanistan turned out to be, in many ways, the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The war devoured the nation's resource, killed off its young men without subduing Afghanistan, and it greatly increased discontent within the Soviet Union about the Soviet system. So, what is this cartoon saying? Well, Afghanistan is a country that has been notoriously hard to conquer or subdue. Just ask Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan, or the British Empire, or the Soviet Union, or, alas, U.S. military leaders. So we have a little crash course in history in one cartoon. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's economy continued to falter. This chart shows three different estimates of economic growth in the Soviet Union. The blue line is the official Soviet government statistics on income growth. The red line is the CIA's estimate of how much the Soviet economy grew. And the green line was the estimate of a Russian, actually a Latvian economist who was a critic of the regime, but also a very careful student of the Soviet economy. Most scholars think that his green line is closest to the truth, but note that even the Soviet government reported declining economic growth decade after decade. So the Soviet economy got especially bad from the mid-1970s on. Defense spending was driving out other spending and using up a huge share of limited resources. The central planning apparatus, the 5-year plans that they used to manage the economy, was too rigid, inflexible, unable to adapt to the demands of the complex modern economy. And the Soviet economy was simply not producing the goods and services that its people needed or wanted. So let's return to the People's Century video for a look at the communist economies. The rebellion against communist political and economic rule began in Poland, and a great deal of credit for the movement and its success goes to the first Polish Pope, Archbishop of Krakow, and then Pope John Paul II. Popes don't always come off looking very good in this course, but this one is a very serious exception, a true world leader. So let's hear from actual participants in the Polish solidarity movement. But the real breakthrough, the real end of communism came when the aging Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev died and was replaced by a quick succession of leaders, ending with the younger and more progressive Mikhail Gorbachev. Back to the video. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies were summed up in two Russian words, and these are words worth knowing: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika refers generally to restructuring the economic system to allow more market competition, although it was also used to describe some political restructuring. Gorbachev was not a Democrat. He continued to call himself a communist, but he did think that there needed to be somewhat more freedom in the Soviet political system. Glasnost meant openness. It meant that people were now free to criticize the regime. Well, Gorbachev was a little stunned by just how many seized the opportunity. Essentially, he started a revolution and it got away from him. Ultimately, and I'm cutting through a lot of very interesting history, which I regret, but ultimately Gorbachev was not able to hang on to power. The very forces that he unleashed overwhelmed him, and all over Eastern Europe and finally in the Soviet Union itself, communism collapsed. Rather than fight to keep Eastern Europe under Soviet control, Gorbachev basically let it go. Even countries such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia that had long been part of the Soviet Union. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was replaced by the Federation of Russian Federation and by surrounding independent countries, some friendly, some not so much, some very much under the influence of Russia, others struggling with Russia. This map shows Eurasia after the fall of communism, or at least for now. Remember Vladimir Putin? We studied him earlier. He's Russia's president. He has gobbled up the Crimea and portions of the Ukraine, and many fear that he is out to restore the Soviet Empire, including the Baltic states that I just mentioned, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Stay tuned. I don't think we know yet where that story is going or where it will end at any rate. So again, I'm cutting a long and complicated story way too short, but I did promise that we would see the end of the Berlin Wall. So here it is. Well, the fall of the wall is a happy ending. The fall of communism, alas, did not just end with a nice fade out to music and the credits rolling. We just saw a cartoon about how Russian expansionism seems to be renewed under Vladimir Putin. The disintegration of communist countries also reignited nasty old ethnic feuds, much as the fall of the Austrian Empire did after World War I. And nowhere did this turn out to be more brutal than the country of Yugoslavia, where genocide once again emerged. Yugoslavia was basically created by the Treaty of Versailles and the other post-World War I treaties. It jumbled together into one nation, people with rather similar ethnic or racial heritage, but very important divisions between Serb Orthodox Christians, Croatian Catholics, and Bosnian Muslims. And even that's too simple, since these groups tended to live intermingled in the same villages and in each other's countries. At any rate, when Yugoslavia began to disintegrate, the Serbs tried to gain control, first of Croatia and then of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The result was still another 20th century genocide. Here again, it's an incredibly complicated story, and I'm going to let a video tell it once again, partly because there are some horrors that simply have to be seen. It's an all too familiar story. The world stands by as horror unfolds. You've seen the video now. This photo shows the mass grave of Muslim men and boys massacred in the Bosnian town Srebrenica that you saw. The massacre mentioned at the end of the video clip. Well, we have seen a great deal of violence and cruelty in our survey of Western civilization. We have also seen men and women who stepped in to make a difference. Think of William Wilberforce fighting against slavery, or the suffragettes standing up for equal political rights for women, or a Rwandan hotel keeper and an American diplomat who tried, who tried to stem the genocide or at least protect some people from it, and the American diplomat you've just seen in the video. You may never witness genocide, but you will all face choices about when to speak up and when to remain silent. It does not have to be an injustice that's going to make the CNN news. How about when you witness someone bullying? What about when a drunk friend is about to get behind the wheel of a car? What about cheating that's going on and nobody reports it because we all know that everybody does it? Don't be the person who turns away, okay? Let me just end by saying it has been a pleasure to teach all of you, even if it's just as the disembodied voice. I wish you Godspeed and hope I get a chance to see some of you next year.